So today I am going to talk about politics and children's literature in the U.S. state of Florida, which I've called home since 1998. I think Florida conjures up a lot of things for people, some of them pictured here. Florida children's literature touches on many aspects of Florida life, some famous, some infamous, some perhaps more everyday. That literature, of course, has always been political in various ways, engaged with the state's legacy of settler colonialism, indigenous displacement, racial persecution, environmental wrangling, urban development, and ongoing migration. But it feels especially political now, or rather current Florida political culture is dominating, if not hijacking, how we think about literature, education, and really public life more generally. When I started teaching and writing about Florida children's literature, I didn't really expect Florida political culture to suddenly grab the global spotlight. If you've been following U.S. political news, you know what I'm talking about. Our governor, Republican Ron DeSantis, has come in like a wrecking ball, presenting himself as a conservative hero in the rebooted cultural wars. And as our now indicted former president, fellow Floridian and political rival Donald Trump likes to remind him, DeSantis rose to the governor's mansion thanks to Trump's endorsement. But after his reelection in 2022, DeSantis is fashioning himself sort of as Trump without the chaos. In the last year, DeSantis has pushed through the Florida legislature a series of new laws restricting freedom of speech and thought and censoring the school curriculum at all levels. Florida, DeSantis likes to declare, is where woke goes to die. And actually, that is the phrase on that T-shirt. Seems to also have migrated to Texas. Florida is where woke likes to die, is what DeSantis likes to say. And by woke, he means basically woke is dismissive shorthand for inclusive politics and consciousness. DeSantis's agenda, is being challenged legally and culturally, so not all is lost. But it's a concerning moment for children's literature, for children, for education, for democracy in Florida. DeSantis's war on woke has sort of fanned the flames of hate and hysteria, and perhaps you've heard about the charter school in Florida that recently pronounced Michelangelo's David sculpture pornographic and unsuitable for the curriculum. A parent complained, and the school's governing board acquiesced and fired the principal who okayed the lesson, which was a Renaissance art lesson. So the internet's obviously had some fun with this story, as you can see here. But again, it's a pretty maddening, enraging, and crazy time to be a Floridian. Florida doesn't deserve this new fascism and doesn't need this bad press. We already had a tricky reputation. In 1948, an observer for Forbes magazine speculated that, quote, "There's something in Florida's humid, languorous air that attracts pirates, derelicts, remittance men, thieves, gamblers, blue sky promoters, black market operators, and all the infections of Western life," end quote. And that was more than 70 years ago. The sometimes benign, sometimes malevolent wackiness of Florida is well documented. In part because of the sunshine laws of open reporting. So we could spend all of our time today looking at so-called Florida Man, tracking that trope across a century, really more of outrageous, dumb, and often criminal behavior. We won't do that. Instead, I'm going to talk about the broader history of Florida children's literature and how it intersects with, and also is separate from, the new political conservatism. So I'm inventing as much as describing the category of Florida children's literature, thinking of it as something between a national and a regional corpus with identifiable but flexible features, including a Florida setting and or a theme. Here are some of the ways that we might consider the category. No matter how we frame it, though, as a body of work and as a cultural commitment, Florida children's literature has expanded and diversified over the years. It will be impacted by the new political conservatism, but it's not reducible to it. Some of the tensions within the literary tradition more generally in the state are also tensions within Florida history and culture at large. Prior to the colonial period, Florida was home to indigenous tribes such as the Seminoles, the Miccosukee, the Timucua, and the Potano. In the colonial period, Florida was largely under Spanish control until the early 19th century, when it became a U.S. territory. Florida was admitted to the Union in 1845 as a slave state, and it joined the Confederacy. Florida's admission as a slave state was part of a broader effort to maintain racial capitalism, not only in the States, but in the Caribbean also. And this was sort of, especially after Haiti had rejected slavery before that. Florida went from being the least populated state in the Union in 1940 to now being the third largest, the third most populous state in the United States, behind California and Texas. Parts of the state are very urban and cosmopolitan, reflecting that rapid growth, and other areas are more rural and generally more politically conservative, although it varies a little. Florida has ties to the U.S. so-called Deep South, to the broader Gulf of Mexico region, to the Caribbean, to all of the Americas, and to Europe, obviously. To make matters more confusing, Florida has never been a self-evident or stable idea, even geographically. Consider Dominic Daly's remarks in 1896 on the screen here in a preface to a reprinted 16th century account of Spanish colonial exploration. And he writes here, "It may be advisable to remind the reader that in the days of De Soto, the name Florida was a vague appellation of the then little-known continent called North America. The Spaniard who first discovered the peninsula at the southeast corner of that continent called the country Florida, without having an idea of the vast extent of the territory stretching away to the north and west for thousands of miles. Thus, for a long time, Florida was a kind of geographical expression of wide but uncertain application. In the course of time and political changes, the name came to be more and more restricted in application, until now it applies only to that comparatively small area, which is included in the United States under the state of Florida." Abraham Ortelius's 1584 map of La Florida gives us a pictorial sense of what Daly is talking about. A century plus later, Florida remains, I think, a, quote, kind of geographical expression of wide but uncertain application, end quote. It remains as much a state of mind or fantasy as a physical place, fashioned first as a semi-exotic frontier, and then as a sort of semi-exotic destination for leisure. And these are all constructions that marked children's literature. There's a significant body of Florida literature in Spanish, and in fact, that material comprises the United States' oldest literary tradition, according to scholar Morris J. O'Sullivan. But as children's literature scholars have emphasized, the Spanish literature or the Spanish tradition doesn't exactly contain what we'd recognize as children's literature today. Florida children's literature seems to have begun as an Anglophone corpus in the early 19th century, with Florida set pirate stories, Indian tales, and Robinsonades. Most of these were pitched to boys. In another key study, O'Sullivan identifies this text, Francis Robert Goulden's Robert and Harold, or the Young Marooners on the Florida coast, as the first Florida novel that was really written for and marketed to younger readers. It was published in 1852, and the book went through 19 editions and half a century. It's set in 1839, and it's a typically Christian and sort of U.S. Southern version of the Robinsonade, heartily endorsing colonialization and racial capitalism, very unapologetic about those things. Drama ensues when its four child characters, three of whom are boys, are marooned on a barrier island near Tampa and must fend for themselves as temporary castaways, which they do admirably, eventually rescuing, but also sort of being rescued by their adults who find them again, who are themselves shipwrecked. So even though the adults rescue them, the kids are still have a leg up of sorts. Unapologetically racist, Robert and Harold worked to secure Florida to the South and to slavery. The popular juvenile series that followed in the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th century likewise tended to present Florida as a setting, as a testing ground, rather, for virulent young men, especially. And it also tended to reflect this sort of expansionist tenor of the U.S. nation, as well as the supporting structure of white supremacy, as with this series about Cuba that has quite a bit of reference to Florida for geographically obvious reasons. DeSantis, our current governor, would like a lot of this, very patriotic, racist, and and traditionally Christian material if he knew about it or bothered to read any of it. If the first wave of Florida kid lib tended to reflect and support the colonization of Florida by white male settlers and endorsing their value systems, a kind of second or subsequent wave continued in the same vein, but spotlights sort of interior rather than coastal Florida. Many of these texts are about the Florida crackers, a term for poor white settlers, mostly from other US states. Many of these settlers worked cattle, and the term cracker refers, among other things, to the whips they would crack over the heads of cattle to encourage them along. The best known cracker story about childhood, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' The Yearling, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 1938, is not a children's book, but it has been kind of positioned as kidlit adjacent, and that was especially in the wake of a film that was made not long after. A cracker title that's more identifiably for kids is Lois Linsky's Strawberry Girl, pictured here also. And this was 1945, and it's part of her regional series. And in fact, Linsky's novel, Strawberry Girl, won the Newbery Medal, which is the premier American award for U.S. children's literature. These books are both set very close to where I live in Gainesville in Central Florida. They don't really break the mold of white storytelling for white kids, but they are notable portrayals of sort of rural and underclass life. And so I think that's a significant shift. By the mid-20th century, some Florida children's literature starts to look a little more what we think of as progressive or oppositional from a contemporary perspective. One of the better books in the children's tradition, which is also white author, but very much concerned with the politics of race in the States, is by another Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. You may recognize that name from the 2018 school shootings at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in South Florida. A journalist, fiction writer, and social activist, Douglas is best remembered as a voice for environmental conservation in Florida, publishing an influential book called River of Grass in 1947, which was her sort of name for the Everglades, and founding the Friends of the Everglades at nearly 80 years old. And she lived to be 108 years old, as you can see here. That's not a typo. Douglas was also committed to social justice, speaking up about the exploitation of West Indian sugarcane workers in South Florida. She wrote several titles for kids, but the most notable one is the book here on the screen on the right, Freedom River, published in 1953. It was reissued again in the 90s. And it's set in 1845, which I mentioned before is a pretty pivotal year in Florida history. Here, Douglas draws on the conventions of the slave narrative as well as the Robinsonade to fashion a powerful story of persecution and survival. Freedom River pivots around the relationship among three boys, a white settler boy named Richard, an escaped slave boy from somewhere in the Caribbean, we don't know where, named Eben, E-B-E-N, and a native Miccosukee boy named Billy. The story opens with Eben washing ashore what's near Miami, having escaped from a slave ship during a storm. The boy's kind of exhilarating realization that he's free and alone at first quickly turns to terror when he's spotted by Richard, the white boy who eventually becomes his friend, and by a Cuban slave trader. While Eben settles in temporarily with Richard's family, the boy's fate remains uncertain in the novel. The slave trader still pursues him, and Richard's father, the white kid's father, actually hires the boy out to work with slaves on a local plantation. After a lot of soul searching, Richard, the white boy semi-protagonist, puts aside his racist fantasies of destiny and power. For a period, Eben escapes to the Everglades and hides with the indigenous folks there, and that was actually what many escaped slaves did do in the time. But as Douglas makes clear, that safety could only be temporary. With the help of Billy and Richard, Eben sails finally for the Bahamas, which are free, and that's what slavery has been abolished there. We don't know if he makes it. The novel ends on that journey. We can only hope that he does. And we also know, too, of course, that the Civil War looms on the horizon in the States just after this, and also, as does the Third War against the Seminoles, which was one of three very vicious campaigns against the Seminole tribe, and really a lot of it was about protecting slavery. Freedom River appeared a year before the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, which required public schools to desegregate. Pushback, of course, was dramatic, with Jim Crow policies persisting well into and beyond the civil rights movement. So Douglas's novel, and this is Freedom River again, it makes clear that the long shadow of slavery is everywhere in the 1950s, and that the fight of racial equality is far from over. In 1955, Douglas became a charter member of the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Miami, which actually organized in response to Florida's homegrown version of McCarthyism, the National Red Scare that dominated American culture into the 1950s. So there's a sort of national and a Florida version of this, and I'll show you a slide in just a second about that. Anyone familiar with Florida history has heard of the Florida Legislative Investigative Committee, known as the Johns Committee, after one of its founders was set up in 1956 in the wake of that Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. So this, again, is sort of the national and the state version of McCarthyism. So Johns Committee and the McCarthy Committee. The original purpose of the Johns Committee in Florida was to impede desegregation. And at first, it investigated members of the NAACP and other civil rights activists and kind of pushed back against activism along those lines. The NAACP managed to slow down the investigations and the committee's attacks by bringing a whole slew of court cases. And so by 1959, it actually looked like the Johns Committee might be disbanded, until, inspired by McCarthyism, it invented a new rationale for its existence, which was the purported spread of homosexuality in state educational systems and institutions. So for the next 7 years, the Johns Committee focused on teachers and students, but mostly teachers, outing them, firing them, and driving not a few to suicide. At my own institution, the University of Florida, 20 faculty were fired and about 50 were expelled. One of them was lesbian novelist Rita Mae Brown, whose 1973 novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle, includes a fictionalized account of Brown's compulsory meeting with the university psychiatrist. Tellingly, Brown was expelled not for homosexuality, but for, quote, race mixing, end quote, as she was involved with a civil rights group. While Freedom River focuses on racial violence and speaks obliquely to the civil rights struggle in particular, Douglas understood that those issues were linked with the persecution of other American undesirables, including queers, labor supporters, Jews, political nonconformists. Douglas recognized that such persecution had to be met with accurate history telling for kids. Freedom River is the kind of story that DeSantis does not want in circulation, as he is reviving the paranoia and resentment that fueled not only the 1990s culture wars, but also the sort of white power maneuvers of the 1950s. Florida children's literature saw notable developments especially in environmental writing and also in Cuban-American sort of literature from that point forward. For a period, the literature seemed to be diversifying even as the state's politics were sort of in flux. Florida was a political swing state and a national bellwether well through the 1990s and even the early 2000s. In presidential elections, the state gave its electoral college votes to Clinton in 96, Bush infamously in 2000, 2004, then Obama in 2008, 2012, and then Trump in 2016 and 2020. Southern Democrats had long actually had a monopoly on state politics, but that started to change in the 1990s. And Florida has not had a Democratic governor since 1998. And that's really the main issue in a lot of the US states is the Republican kind of control of the state legislatures and the state governor's offices. While progressivism does remain alive in the state very much, the state has overall lurched rightward in the last 5 to 10 years, with Republicans now holding an actual advantage in voter registration on top of their practices of gerrymandering, which is voting district manipulation, basically. Writings on the natural environment of Florida have a long history and take a lot of interest and direction, and this is a whole other topic. that we could spend a lot of time on, but we won't. Stories sympathetic to animals range in genre from what I've elsewhere described as the fairy tale, as here with Raoul and the Porpoise, which is actually about a boy rescued by and temporarily raised by porpoises, to more realistic eco-mysteries such as George's The Missing Gator of Gumbo Limbo, and to more kind of activist titles. Activist may not be quite the right word, but there's an argument to be made there, and some scholars have argued that Hyacinth's books for kids are actually sort of activist environmental novels. The development of Cuban-American children's literature, meanwhile, happened in the wake of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Most Cuban-American children's literature is set in Florida, so it has a very strong Florida texture, especially in the Miami area. In Cuban-American children's literature, we see competing ideologies and commitments, especially as new generations of writers emerge. The kind of two main traditions of Cuban-American and Cuban Floridian literature are exile narrative, in which Cuban childhood is sort of recollected in light of the revolution and its ruptures, and heritage literature, in which Cuban identity sort of persists alongside the challenges of acculturation, so maintaining some sense of Cubanness through family, food, ritual, literature, poetry. Heritage literature runs the gamut from stories preoccupied with the transition from Cuba to the United States for the families, to more contemporary titles in which that history is really a pretty faint memory because it's been many, many, many decades, sometimes for the writers, and it's not something experienced about directly or thought much about by some of the protagonists in this tradition. Exile stories often focus a lot on Florida, and one example in the exile tradition is Enrique Flores Galvez's 90 Miles to Havana, which was published in 2010. And this title references the distance from Havana to Key West, which is only 90 miles. So whereas Key West to Miami is, I think, 150 miles. So at that point, you're closer to Havana than you are to even South Florida, the mainland South Florida. As a child, the author of this novel, Flores Galvez, participated in Operation Peter Pan, which was a 1960 to 1962 campaign in which 14,000 Cuban children were relocated to Florida and placed with surrogate caretakers. And so it's a fictionalized account of his own experience. And in this fictionalized account, Flores Galvez's protagonist, Julian, and his brothers land in Miami, and specifically in a refugee camp. But after his brothers sort of move into an orphanage, Julian runs away and finds new purpose with a young man who's actually helping people escape Havana by boat. So he winds up going back to Havana undercover and helping move more people from Cuba to Florida. The novel is generally kind of pro-America, but it does acknowledge the benefits of the revolution for some Cubans as well, while also, on the other hand, spotlighting the difficulties that Cubans had in the States, assimilating and just getting basic access to resources. In the heritage tradition, and there are many stories in this tradition, but one of the notable series is Meg Medina's Mercedes Suarez's middle grade trilogy, beginning with her Newbery Medal. Mercedes Suarez Changes Gears, 2018. Like other Cuban Floridian titles for kids, Medina's trilogy emphasizes the pleasures and complexities of family, school, community, food, and language in contemporary South Florida. All three of the Mercedes Suarez titles brilliantly engage, I think, with the microaggressions based on class and race differences, both between the white and Cuban community and also within the Cuban-American or Cuban Floridian community. There are a lot of examples from the books. In the first book, for example, the family acknowledges the risks that are faced by Mercy's brother, Raleigh, as a non-white boy if he's stopped by the police. And Mercedes Suarez plays it cool, 2022, which is the final installment. Mercy's class visits St. Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest continually occupied city in the United States. And that visit provides Medina with an opportunity to critique not just American racism, but really broader colonizer practices, including those of the Spanish. When one Cuban-American student declares that she might be a descendant of Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who was the so-called founder of St. Augustine and the first governor of Florida, Spanish Florida, when one student makes the claim that she may be a descendant of this person. Another one says, right, the guy who hung the bodies from the trees, referring to his massacre of French Huguenots. Mercy herself points out that Ponce de Leon, quote, came looking for the fountain of youth, but had to settle for a spring in St. Augustine. She says, I'm pretty sure the water didn't work since he's dead himself, but whatever. And another recollection, Mercy wonders what kind of privilege it takes to become a Henry Flagler. And Flagler was an oil, hotel, and railroad magnate, major developer in Florida. And she decides, maybe you have to roll with really rich people like Flagler did. While it doesn't entertain directly the politics of the Cuban Revolution, Medina's trilogy does speak to the experiences of Cuban Americans living in Florida in the Trump era. In her 2019 Newbery Medal speech, Medina, she's also the national ambassador for young people's literature this year, 2023 to 2024, remarks on the challenges of, quote, how to write in a time when so many disparaging characterizations of Latinx people have been taking hold. And so this would have been during the Trump presidency, whether it was aspersions being cast or border separations or the frightening uncertainty for the dreamers. I wanted to shake the world and shout, stop afflicting children with these terrible and hurtful words. Stop warping their view about who they are and what their value is. It's hard enough to start a life in a new place. Latinx Florida kidlit is really increasingly rich and diverse, focusing not only on Cuban identity, but also on Black and Latinx Caribbean and South American experience as they intersect with U.S. politics. Consider, for example, Romina Garber's Lobezona 2020, which a trans-affirmative werewolf tale set in a magic school in the Everglades about an undocumented child of Argentine parents dealing with the U.S. immigration and customs enforcement with ICE, dedicated to, quote, all of our children caught in the crosshairs of nationalism, end quote. Lobezona opens with these lines, some people are illegal. Lobezonas do not exist. Both of these statements are false. So a lot to unpack here, and there is a sequel, which I have not yet read. Florida children's literature that centers Black and or queer experience is less well established. Black Floridians had little to no access to white publishing culture in the South, and indeed endured violent racial persecution. As far as I can tell, the only Black children's writer from the early 20th century who really managed to publish in the Deep South was Arne Bontemps, who collaborated with Langston Hughes and went on to publish material about rural Black life. And this has been really fabulously examined by Kate Capshaw, among other people. Hughes and Bontemps, by the way, published projects set in Haiti and in Mexico, partly to emphasize Black affinities with political cultures outside the United States. Until recently, the children's books about African American and African diasporic life in Florida have been written and published by white people, such as Elvina Garner's Ezekiel, which was 1937. It's unfortunately written in Black dialect. Buckland Moon's The Darker Brother, 1942, which is a more interesting text, and the author more progressive and actually sort of basically persecuted by the McCarthy Committee. And Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, The Secret River, 1955. So these are all examples of white-authored texts about African Americans in Florida. In 1967, Alabama native and Harlem Renaissance figure Ellen Tarry published a book about the early Florida years of African-American writer and activist James Weldon Johnson. But that's about as close as we get for some time to sort of Black writing for kids about Florida specifically. Now, I may well be missing text, so I hope some of the folks attending this can send me suggestions of places to look. Elsewhere, I've talked about Zora Neale Hurston as a Florida writer, a Florida children's writer of sorts, as she focused on childhood experience across her work and drew sort of heavily on her own idyllic childhood in Eatonville, which was the Black incorporated self-governed town near Orlando, a very significant place. Although she did not identify as a children's writer, Black writers for children have positioned Hurston that way, especially in recent years. And this slide gives you a sense of that. And on top of that, her classic novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is a staple in high school English classes. For the most part, Black Black Florida children's literature seems to be still a kind of recovery project, and a lot of it's historical fiction for obvious reasons. And a good bit of that is being published now, and some of it by writers of color, and pretty much all of it focused on Black people's experience. Sharon Draper's 2006 novel Copper Sun, for example, which won the National Book Award, tells the story of the transatlantic slave trade and takes its teen girl protagonist from Africa to a South Carolina plantation, and finally to Fort Mose, Florida. Fort Mose was a Spanish fort in St. Augustine. It was established in 1738 as a free Black settlement, and by the governor of Spanish Florida, and it has a fascinating history. The graphic novel that's represented on the right, Swim Team, meanwhile has a contemporary setting, but touches on the history of segregated swimming pools, as well as, while it's also celebrating the achievements of Black athletes. Also less well established is queer Florida children's literature, by which I mean, mostly out in kind of gay affirmative material. And there's a much bigger conversation to be had about sort of queer Florida kidlit, more expansively imagined. But in terms of sort of quote unquote out literature, there's P. Ryan's The Saints of Augustine, 2007, a novel that confronts some difficult topics. There's the collaboratively written and drawn comic series Goldie Vance, which is really terrific. Again, lots to talk about there, no time, but the Goldie Vance series is set in 1960s South Florida and features a biracial queer girl protagonist whose mother, by the way, is a mermaid, works as a mermaid. And a former UF student, actually, Maria Andrade Mora, is soon to release, I think it's actually out this week or will be, a lesbian coming-of-age story is set in the Florida mangroves called The Immeasurable Depth of You, and a picture of that here. Robbie Weber has published 2 white kind of gay boy romance novels. I've read this one. It's pretty silly, but it's amusing. And the queer title, though, that I found the most suggestive is Lou Vickers' lesbian coming-of-age YA novel Breathing Underwater, which was also published in 2007, and I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. Obviously, a lot of Florida children's literature, and certainly material by and about Black and queer people, is potentially under attack now, thanks to Governor DeSantis's war on woke. If Governor DeSantis's new laws are not limited in concern to children's books, as they're certainly not limited to children's literature, they do make children's books potential targets as part of so-called woke culture. And DeSantis is right. These books are woke in that they acknowledge structures of privilege and oppression. The first DeSantis initiative that threatens to undermine a vital body of work for kids is the so-called Parental Rights in Education Law, which is known colloquially as the Don't Say Gay Law, which prevents classroom, so it's the first one here, which prevents classroom discussions of any LGBTQ issues for students in kindergarten through 4th grade, and it limits discussions for older students. The law frames any LGBTQ material, fiction, nonfiction, in the curriculum, out of the curriculum, as potentially, if not automatically, harmful to minors, or variably obscene. And so I've given you some language here about what those 2 terms mean. Harmful to minors laws are rooted in the concept of variable obscenity, which basically means that material can be considered obscene when viewed by children, but not necessarily obscene when viewed by adults. And this was all derived from a 1973 Supreme Court decision, Miller versus California. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, DeSantis accused opponents of the Don't Say Gay Law, who basically are defenders of LGBT civil rights. He accused those opponents as sexualizing kindergartners. DeSantis's press secretary, meanwhile, tweeted that the Don't Say Gay Law should be known instead as the Anti-Grooming Law. So it's one of the oldest plays, right, in the right-wing playbook. Accuse your opponents, and especially the queers, of wanting to seduce your kids. Sex education prior to the 5th grade was already banned in Florida prior to all of this. But the Don't Say Gay Law doesn't just prevent sex education. It forbids the mere admission that queer people exist. The law also requires schools to notify parents when their children receive mental health support. And it empowers parents to sue schools over teachings they find uncomfortable. So the next law right after that was the Individual Freedom Act, or Stop Woke Law, which was passed to ban the teaching across all levels of, quote, critical race theory, end quote. In other words, any acknowledgement of systemic racism or any kind of social oppression or inequity. A federal judge has blocked the enforcement of this law at the university level, calling it an abuse of First Amendment and free speech rights, but it remains in effect at the K through 12 level. Stop Woke, so-called Stop Woke, this second law, was followed by the Curriculum Transparency Law. These were all in the space of a year, which requires that all books and media in public school classrooms be pre-approved by state-certified media specialists, which is basically being run by a right-wing group called Moms for Liberty. And they're kind of constitute membership on that certification group. The curriculum transparency measure was signed into law 5 months after an incident at an Orange County school board meeting went viral. And this is what happened in that meeting. A member of the public read from Maya Kababi's graphic memoir, Genderqueer, which includes descriptions of sex acts, but it's really also about not wanting and not choosing to have sex, among other things. The person who was reading from this scandalous book at the meeting was actually removed from the meeting. And soon after, a few copies were pulled from the libraries, and now it's found and now essentially the curriculum transparency law has been passed. So here's some kind of propaganda from the governor's office about the curriculum transparency law. If you read this and knew nothing else about it, you think, oh yeah, this is great. You know, parents have the right to see the material, but anyway, there's a lot more to the story, obviously. Right now, the Florida legislature is considering a measure that would not only defund university initiatives in diversity and equity and gender programs, but also any courses that are, quote, theoretical, end quote. So I guess that means physics and things like that too. The bill would also shift decision-making about faculty hiring and retention from faculty committees to presidents and boards of trustees, basically abandoning peer review. Meanwhile, DeSantis has rejected the College Board's advanced placement exam in African American history. He's taken over a progressive liberal arts college, and installed a kind of Western civilization center inside my institution, University of Florida, called the Hamilton Center. He's signed new abortion restrictions, with more to come probably. Put in place bans on gender-affirming care for trans people. He even took on Walt Disney World when Disney objected to the Don't Say Gay law. And in retribution to their objection, DeSantis persuaded our legislature to strip Disney of the taxing and legal privileges it's enjoyed since 1972. That battle continues while other fronts are opening up. What's happening in Florida is an especially concentrated version of what's happening across the United States. The implications for Florida children's literature are pretty clear. The Don't Say Gay law effectively prohibits LGBTQ materials in school classrooms, while the Stop Woke law prevents the teaching of material acknowledging the realities of racism or white privilege. Meanwhile, the Curriculum Transparency Law forbids any content that might be found harmful to minors. The State Board of Education encourages media specialists who are supposed to review all of these materials to err on the side of caution in their vetting, as parents can challenge their decisions and can petition to have materials banned, as they in fact have done. The law applies not just to the school library, to the official library, but to any collection of books in a school setting, including informal libraries maintained by teachers. Hence the many pictures on the internet of empty or cloaked classrooms. Empty or cloaked bookshelves in classrooms. Many schools are requiring the removal of all books until they can be vetted. And this is what's happening in quite a few. All of the books have been pulled until they can be screened. It's a bleak situation, notes Jonathan Friedman of PEN America. We've got teachers teaching on eggshells in classrooms with no books. The law establishes a mechanism by which any material might be banned. And it shifts decision-making, obviously, away from teachers In fact, teachers can be convicted of third-degree felony charges if they violate this policy. Media specialists, the ones who review the materials, meanwhile, are in very short supply, mostly because of budget cuts, which means it may be forever or never before material gets reviewed. People are pushing back against this on social media, at school and community forums, through so-called pop-up libraries and guerrilla giveaways outside the schools. But it's a pretty alarming development. And by the way, some of you may have seen this too, a recent list of 350 titles that were approved by grade level was recently put out by the Florida Department of Education, and the list misspells 9th and 12th for materials for 9th and 12th grades. This is actually, I checked it myself, this is actually real. Collectively, these measures limit what kids might encounter in and around schools. They would likely deinstitutionalize some existing curricular literature, as well as prevent the free reading, right, that takes place around the curriculum, meaning that kids will also just miss out on the more informal, serendipitous, and potentially formative encounters with books. According to a 2022 Penn report, prior to all of this legislation, Florida already had the second highest number of book bans in the United States, trailing only Texas. One parent notes that among the books pulled from shelves at her local school are Dashka Slater's The 57 Bus, a nonfiction account of an agender teen set on fire by another teen, and Angie Thomas's blockbuster The Hate You Give, about the aftermath of a shooting by a black teen by a white police officer. The books they pulled make their political agenda so clear, says one parent. Excuse me, but it's total bullshit. Keep in mind that effectively all books are banned from the start, right? Presumed guilty until proven innocent. With conventional book banning, individual titles are singled out for removal. In this new order, all books are restricted, and individual titles are singled out for potential recovery or inclusion. Neither The Hate You Give nor The 57 Bus is a Florida title, per se, but they may be early examples of a new category of Florida children's lit, which is books banned in Florida schools. Banned books, after all, often make for an interesting canon of sorts. Textually, Florida titles such as Draper's Copper Sun isn't offensively woke in the way that DeSantis imagines. It doesn't actually imply that the fallout of slavery is ongoing, even though it clearly is. But it still remains to be seen whether a book like that will be authorized for school inclusion. The Stop Woke law bans not just the teaching of critical race theory, but, and quote, this is the term this is how critical race theory is defined. Any instruction on race relation or diversity that might imply a person's status as either privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, national origin, or sex. That's the working definition of critical race theory in the legislation. It also prohibits, this is the Stop Woke law again, it also prohibits employee training that might acknowledge realities like white privilege or race-based oppression. And once again, what's happening in Florida is happening many other places in the states. As of early February, UCLA's law school CRT Forward Tracking Project has tracked 567 anti-critical race theory efforts at the local, state, and federal levels. And seven U.S. states have adopted this language, have banned critical race theory, even though no one really understands what that is. And 16 more are considering it. So I've talked about how some Florida titles contest privilege and diversity and equity. And I'll close with one more example, which I mentioned earlier, and that's Lou Vickers' Breathing Underwater. Breathing Underwater is not, as it might sound, a mermaid story, but rather a novel about a girl who nearly drowns literally and symbolically due to her mother's hostility. What makes this novel so powerful, and I think an appropriate bookend for the talk, is not only its open expression of queer desire, although there is that, but also it's linking a parental hostility to the dream called Florida, to the dream of Florida. The family in the novel lives in Chattahoochee, Florida, which is a real place in the Panhandle, where the state hospital is located, and the character's mother works in the state hospital. The protagonist, Lily, correctly links her mother's longing for escape to the myth-making of Florida tourism. And that line at the top of the screen here is the first line in the novel. What Mama wanted what Mama wanted in life was to cruise around Florida like a Yankee tourist in a Cadillac convertible. She wanted to wear a short linen sundress stamped all over with pink flamingos and so on. This all sounds fine. I've shared this desire myself. But the problem is what she decidedly does not want is her own family, and especially her queer daughter. And so Lily has to fend for herself and survive her mother's abuse. Her mother does actually also die in the novel. The author, Lou Vickers, by the way, knows a thing or two about Florida tourism, having also published studies of classic Florida attractions, such as Weeki Wachee Springs, which is the home of the live mermaid shows, and Cypress Gardens. These are both kind of local famous attractions. Lyrical and heartbreaking, Breathing Underwater merges Florida longing with the violent desire that queer kids not exist. As Eve Sedgwick wrote in a very famous essay in 1991, it's always open season on gay kids. And Vickers' linking of tourist desire and anti-queer feeling is especially interesting to me, given how tourism and sort of queer life have colluded and collided in Florida for decades. And these are some studies of queer culture in the state, in different parts of the state. Books like Freedom River and Breathing Underwater are not going to solve the problems that are in front of us, obviously, but I think their existence does matter. I think it's important to signal boost those titles. The fuller story of politics and children's literature in the Sunshine State obviously needs to document the broader tradition, as I've tried to do a little bit here, and across the ideological spectrum, but also tracking how that tradition sort of is and isn't impacted by the new censorship of DeSantis and company as that plays out in the next couple of years. That censorship is already limiting the circulation of existing books, and surely makes more difficult the appearance of new and needed material on diverse topics and for diverse audiences. So thank you. I will stop at that point. Hopefully I have not gone on too long.
Thank you. Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation in which you showcased the richness, the diversity, of Floridian children's literature, and you also introduced our audience to all of these ridiculous legislations. And I'm sure that there will be lots of questions. So remember that you can just raise your hand if you want to ask your question, but you can also use the chat function, and I'll read the question if you don't feel like just raising your little digital hands.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for the great talk on culture wars and on how important children's literature and culture more broadly, again, is in all this. We know a little bit of that, I guess, from our Polish context as well. I have two questions. One is about children's culture more broadly. So is this just about literature? Probably not. It's probably about films as well, other forms of cultural production. So maybe if you could address this. And the other question is about the reaction of the community more broadly to all this, to the new laws, to censorship, bans, and so on. Okay, by the local community, I mean children's literature scholars, among others, educators, broadly speaking, maybe reading promoters, and children as well, young readers. So if there is something, especially if you could maybe say about young people's reactions to all this. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Justina, first of all, for having me, and I certainly enjoy being here. So I think that those are both great questions. Obviously, the question about children's culture more generally is one I really kind of was tempted to try to get into, but I was already I have to say, a little annoyed that Ron DeSantis had kind of hijacked my own research agenda a little bit. I mean, it's been good in the sense that I do feel like I have a framework for thinking about, sort of where the state has been. And in a way, as alarming as the current moment is, you also can clearly see it as ongoing tradition, right? And I think in children's popular media culture, that's maybe a slightly different story. I mean, I think the Disney, the Disney context is probably the most obvious place to start there, and it's Disney's fight with DeSantis is fascinating and multi-pronged. And does that make them necessarily always the best advocates? No, but I mean, what a strange moment when, I'm actually now sort of, because the powers that DeSantis stripped from Disney, were basically powers that should never have been enjoyed by them as a company, as we probably know. I think one of the observers called Walt Disney World the Vatican with mouse ears, because it really functioned almost, completely autonomously. And so, it's a funny moment because the state has been in bed with Disney for so long. That's very surprising to see this development. But Disney has been pushing back, and I think a lot of it is recognition that Disney has a strong progressive commitment, even if it's sort of superficial in some ways. So maybe strong progressive is not quite the right way to. They're very interested in progressive, what they think of as progressive representation and identity politics. But beyond that, I mean, I think, there are a lot of other more local things to look at. The Zora Neale Hurston sort of phenomenon is fascinating because Hurston's really not only in the curriculum, but there's a really big festival which a lot of families attend, and they do a lot of workshops for youth. They do storytelling sessions. They do theater, kind of impromptu theater, all kinds of cool things. And so that's, I think, one of the areas where you really see, and it's an organization that is sort of part of the Hurston Trust, but works with the Tampa area, especially, and all these other in school districts. So I don't know. That's a kind of vague response in a way, but I think there's activity there. There's certainly activity around some of the book festivals, and then the other thing I didn't talk about much was the book awards for the state, which pushed in a lot of different directions, and it's just kind of a big topic. But yeah, I mean, I have to say, I feel like it's really reassuring to know that people around the world are watching what's happening with this. I've had many conversations with people, who basically say, well, what is actually going on? And also, how can we help as scholars and as colleagues? And I think you just keep doing the things you're doing, sort of like just take to the streets, speak when you can, make use of social media, teach the material. And we see a lot of that happening. And then, frankly, on the ground here in Florida, there's a lot of that happening too. Yeah, but I mean, I know that this kind of censorship, this kind of reaction it's not unheard of, and there are a lot of places that have really struggled, I think, with the representation of queer kids, especially. So, I think it varies in context. So I'm not sure if that speaks to either of your questions. It may dodge both of them.
Yes, it does. Certainly it does. Thank you so much. I know it's also all very fresh in a way, and it's time. And let's hope nothing worse happens. I mean, we look at it. I guess we are looking at it with support, but also with a lot of worries and fears, about what is feasible in the first place, right? Yeah. What politicians can do to culture. Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah. One tiny detail, which is not about the children's part, but one of the funny things about Florida is, despite all of these problems, it's actually the only state where every major university in the state and the state system is fully unionized. So we actually have a faculty union. And I think some of these initiatives are just going to continue to meet a lot of resistance at that level. But I do think the question of like how K through 12, sort of collaborates with university level. I think that's really the kind of question is, how do we present a unified front there? And like in our university, the local lab school is part of the bargaining unit. So that's a kind of laboratory school for the university. It's a K through 12 laboratory school. And so they're involved in that. But that's, of course, not necessarily true for others, in other contexts, and private schools and a lot of the private schools are capitulating to some of these things, even though they don't have to legally. And that's really concerning. So anyway, be quiet on that.
Yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Stina, for these fantastic questions. So we have two more questions in the meeting chat, and I think that Mar Sanchez, who wanted to ask the first question, is here. So Mar Sanchez, can you go ahead with your question, and then we'll have another question, and then I'll read the ones from the meeting chat.
Hello, I'm so sorry about that. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I had to come out the call earlier because it just wasn't working. So I hope this hasn't been asked already, but are there any other spaces or institutions that are not formal education so how have, for example, public libraries been affected by these policies? Are they in some way freer in their choosing of materials? Are there any spaces, I guess, where you could still, what's that like?
So yes, and the policies at this point apply to state public funded state schools, public schools in the state, and not to private schools. But unfortunately, in Florida, a lot of the private schools are charter schools with a sort of religious emphasis, and so they're not necessarily leaning, toward the defense of some of these principles. So the Michelangelo sculpture thing is a good example. That was a charter school that didn't have to make any concession to Ron DeSantis, but unfortunately, the school board was already thinking, the people trying to sexualize our kids. And so they just decided to do that, and they were not legally obliged to do anything of the sort. Obviously, so I hope, I know there are private schools and magnet schools and private art academies, things like that are actually committed to what we think of as a more progressive curriculum and principles of democratic democratic citizenship, and opposed to censorship. So, but I don't know enough about that, and there may be people in the audience that do. But it is mostly if you're out from under if you're not being funded by the state, you don't necessarily have to oblige. It's all about taxpayer money.
Thank you, Kenneth. That was really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. You. And we have one more question from Chris Blumel. So please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Chris Blumel. I'm speaking from the Jersey shore of New Jersey, Monmouth University. I wanted to tell you first that I was unable to put a question in the chat. So I don't know, I get it says chat in channel meetings is only available to team members. So I don't know if there are other people in your audience who might, like I, be in their like jogging clothes and not want to raise their hand or put on the video and wanted to ask a question in the chat. But thank you, Kenneth. More importantly, I am wondering about your institutional position as a scholar of children's lit in the current political climate. And that's a very general wording, but could you speak to that? Maybe you feel more like a lightning rod. Maybe you feel like you have a responsibility to lead the way, but I'd be very interested in your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And just so you know, I can't actually see the chat either, so I'm not sure what is and isn't in chat. It's probably probably an error on my part, or the way I've accessed it.
No. I'll read, and no worries, because some people can see the chat, others can't, but I can see it, and I will read the question. So I know it's there. Okay. So there are only 2 questions, and I will read them. No worries.
Fine. I wanted people to know I love reading the chat, and I'm afraid to click too many buttons. But thank you for that question. So yeah, I haven't become a lightning rod yet. That could still potentially happen. If this goes viral, as Mateusz was saying, maybe we can make that happen. No, I mean, I think it would be, clearly this whole campaign is about, sort of rousing the right-wing political base in Florida about political theater with real consequences. And I think anything that could be attention-grabbing in terms of headlines, would be something the governor's office is actively looking for. And to be quite honest with you, we're already, the English department at University of Florida is already sort of on the radar. in that way. We have managed to annoy not only our board of governors, but apparently our governor himself. Be a good bit of the union leadership is in our department and in the history department. But yeah, it's an interesting time to be a scholar of queer kid lit in Florida. That's for sure. I do feel like we have an obligation to speak and to write editorials and to advocate for our students and for the kids. There's so much rhetoric about freedom and transparency, and but it's a very, very select, obviously. And so that's something that is quite disturbing. I'm not really sure yet to see how it plays out. I'm more concerned about my junior colleagues, frankly, and about people who maybe have not been through the tenure and promotion system. And also, I'm just concerned about, our younger scholars of color who are already, in Florida, already facing a kind of a set of pressures that I don't face, and so I think that's really concerning. I think this a lot of people are wondering, is Florida a safe place, to be if you are not completely in the conservative sort of norm here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at the two questions from the chat. So the first one is actually connected to Justina's question, but I will read it anyways. It's from Liliana Santos. Thank you so much, Kenneth, for such an enriching presentation. I was wondering what we as scholars can do to fight against children's books bans from proliferating, and how can we be more involved in our communities in order to promote accurate knowledge regarding racial and gender representation in children's literature. Thank you. So that's the first question, and I'll read the second one. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask, what is the current situation of the Florida-based opposition to DeSantis? Charlie Crist himself, a former Republican governor, lost last year's election by a significant margin. Are there any figures or movements you see that could effectively challenge DeSantis?
I hope so. I mean, it is true that the governor's re-election was a huge blow. I do think that the Democratic Party in the state is in disarray and has been for some time, in terms of both organizing and in terms of kind of having charismatic sort of younger leaders. And I think there has been a little bit of an establishment sort of suppression of some of the more kind of exciting people who are younger in the party who might actually be the new faces of Florida. Florida is a multi-ethnic, diverse, exciting state, and it's an outrage and a shame that people don't see that, and that it's not currently reflected in the political sort of leadership. So I don't know. I mean, I have to say, I think the biggest thorn in DeSantis's side is the labor movement in Florida and the labor unions. Not only at the universities, but also the Florida sort of the association, basically, of teachers, and I think that has been a bit of a firewall. The unions have been able to file injunctions and grievances that are slowing down, in some cases leading to suspensions of parts of the policy. So the suspension of the sections of the Don't Say Gay law, for example. And right now, there's a good bit of resistance going on still to a set of measures that are being considered right now to halt diversity and equity programming, paid for by the state again. And that's, I don't think it's stalling, but I think there's been more resistance than expected. And that's just been a coordinated campaign of calls and letters and texts and just contacting your representative. And so I think there is significant opposition. I wish we saw that at the level of voting, and I don't think people quite understood what the DeSantis's possibilities were. And so I think that's kind of where you see most of the opposition. Yeah, and as far as what people can do, I think you're fabulous colleagues, I love that you asked that. I don't know the answer myself. I think about this daily, like what do I need to be doing better, differently, more? What kinds of forums would be the most appropriate? I do think that if you have a sense of if you don't feel personally endangered, I think you do have the responsibility to speak up for other people and to speak up for the systems that you believe in. And we're certainly trying to do that on multiple fronts. But I do live in a fairly progressive college town that has a lot of activism, and it is a particular kind of culture. So I can't speak more broadly in terms of what's happening in other parts of the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, Justina, one more question. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, that's maybe a kind of, maybe not really a tangential question, but let's say earlier during, I don't know, Trump's presidency, for example, or before, was there actually any literature published pro-Trump, right? Or actually, kind of actually inscribing itself into the current climate in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, and I don't know the current state of it. You're completely right to ask about that. I've been thinking about Michelle Abate's work on raising them right, and on the the importance of documenting. Yeah, exactly. Like and it's just so odious to look at. So part of my commitment has just been to sort of signal boosting some of these titles that are perhaps not getting the attention they deserve, and in some cases are out of print. And probably need to be back in print. But yeah, there is that kind of literature, and it's sort of, it's kind of almost like it's really almost like a kind of very crude advertising PR literature that kind of fades into those T-shirt mottos that I was showing at the beginning. There's a kind of charisma cult around DeSantis now that's also kind of being modeled around the one that was on Trump, where basically, I mean, I've seen people fly giant DeSantis flags on their boats and on the back of pickup trucks. I mean, it's just like this iconography, and often you'll see that in conjunction with the Confederate flag and some of the symbols of sort of antebellum Southern life. And so there is a literature, and there's also, of course, more generally materials that sort of take those positions without necessarily being about those figures. But I have to confess, I haven't spent much time with it. So, and should probably.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I wanted to say that I'm very happy that you mentioned books about nature, because Florida is such a beautiful state. The Floridian nature is just spectacular, and I think that it's something that many people just don't know, because we're so focused on this, Florida man stereotype, and we've been talking about DeSantis and politics, and I think that it's important for people to know that there's a different Florida in Florida, and that nature is a big part of it. So I'm very happy that you talked about these books, and I hope that there will be more books about all of these beautiful swamps and gators and other amazing creatures, and that's something that we should also preserve, your beautiful nature. Yeah. So that's just a random thought, a minor comment.
That's probably one of the richest strains, really, of the Florida literary tradition in general, and certainly of the children's literature tradition. And it's pretty, pro-conservationist and pretty critical of overdevelopment. And there's a lot of people working on that front in a wide range of genres. The eco mystery is a pretty common one. And Hyacinth's work is super interesting. And So yeah, I think there's definitely that commitment, which has been there for a long time and is not waning. And interesting, there's some interesting bridging with environmental justice theming with sort of social justice. So you see that a little bit in some of the more recent YA titles that are Cuban-American, for example, sort of bring them together. So that's encouraging as well,
And when it comes to Cuban-American titles, which you mentioned, are most of these books Anglophone? Are they Anglophone? Are they written in English, or are they translations from Spanish, or are they bilingual?
They are largely English language. There is a tradition of Cuban material for kids. It's primarily Spanish, and most of which does not find its way across to Florida, and that's a whole nother conversation, but and has roots to basically Castro's project of rebuilding culture and rebuilding society. But yeah, most of those titles are there. There are some that experiment with sort of there's a bilingual tendency to many of them, and there are even some that in my opinion, the best ones use quite a bit of Spanish and don't translate. There are several that do that, and so I think that's really nice. But they're not truly bilingual texts in that they're really English language texts with some Spanish typically. But yeah. And most of them have been published by major houses, so which is interesting too. And not all of them are completely Florida focused. There's some Margarita Engel, for example. A lot of her work's been about Cuba, but she's actually more California sort of aligned, and so it's been more her protagonists spend time in California more than they do Florida. But
Thank you. So, thank you for your wonderful talk, and I would like to thank the audience for all of your fantastic questions. And I think that we'll have more questions, but we have to process. We all have to process all of the things you talked about, because there are so many similarities, between Florida and Poland when it comes to our politics, and so I think that all of us will have to process certain things, think about them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would be very curious to hear those conversations. So please share your thoughts, and thank everybody for your patience and time today.